Hello, my name is Jessica Putman, and I am the student coordinator for the Roxborough Roundtables. I would like to welcome everyone to the Roundtables. Today our topic is architecture, old buildings, historic preservation, and sustainability. And our host today would be Dr. David Breiner.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Roundtable on the built environment, historic preservation, and sustainability. We have three intertwined issues before us. First, there is the built environment, sometimes understood as old houses, and its role in society. You're probably familiar with Winston Churchill's statement, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." Many of our faculty, students, and staff on this campus deal with this issue every day. A second issue is historic preservation and its economic, environmental, and social impacts on our society. Some of us here today pursue or plan to pursue careers in that discipline. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is among the most prominent national organizations that promote support for preservation in the built environment. A third issue is sustainability, a growing interest across the country which is championed by the U.S. Green Building Council and the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, among other groups. Interestingly, organizations not established to promote both of the last two issues are routinely making connections between historic preservation and sustainability. Among them are the National Institute of Building Sciences, the Association for Preservation Technology International, the American Society of Landscape Architects, and other groups. How does the built environment and its preservation impact our lives? With the advanced technologies we have available today, is it possible that older buildings and landscapes can challenge new construction in terms of sustainability? So I'm David Breiner, Associate Professor of Architectural History Theory and Associate Dean in the College of Architecture and the Built Environment. I have been researching the history of Roxborough House since receiving a grant in 2005 to document the campus history, and I'd like to invite the rest of our invited panelists to introduce themselves.
I'm Jessica Martin. I'm an fourth-year architecture major with a historic preservation minor.
Tom Becker, I'm the AVP for operations here.
Susanna Baruco, historic preservation consultant, and I teach the adaptive reuse capstone studio in historic preservation curriculum.
My name's Rob Fleming. I'm the director of the Sustainable Design Program here at the university.
My name is Dominic Hawkins. I'm the managing principal of Preservation Design Partnership, and I actually worked on this building. Kim Douglas, I'm the director of the Landscape Architecture Program.
Anthony Arnaud, I'm a fourth-year student in the Architecture Studies and a Historic Preservation concentration.
Thank you. So our goals for today are to discuss several topics, which would include the general impact of the built environment on people, whether preserving buildings is worthwhile and or sustainable, what lessons were learned at Roxborough House, and finally, what students should learn about these issues in their education. So I guess I would like us to get started by addressing the first issue, which is what is the general impact of the built environment on people? Most of the people in this room, I think, would say that that's kind of obvious, and do we even have to discuss it? But I think if you talk to the general population, they might have different responses to that. So is anyone interested in getting us started by addressing this perception that maybe the built environment doesn't have a big impact on people? Please identify yourself.
This is Susanna. I'll jump in just to get us started. I don't think I have anything profound to say, but I think often people don't realize the impact of the environment. When I taught the intro class, one of the first things that I would ask is, is there a building in your neighborhood that you pass a lot, that you have some connection with, or that makes you feel like you're home when you see it? And I think people can respond to a more roundabout question like that, although if you ask them, is the built environment important to you, they might not really know how to respond. So sometimes I think it's the way the question is posed and the way people see the world is not always the same.
Tom Becker, I think the built environment on a campus is especially important. So I think it helps forge memories of for students while they're here, and I think maybe it's a contributing factor to why a student that is considering other campuses might choose one campus over another. You know, whether they feel at home when they get there, and whether it feels like the right place for them. I'm interested in the students' perspective, really.
Jess, the built environment of this campus was actually one of the reasons I did decide to go here, because it's a much more homey feel with all the old buildings, that you can see the history of the school, whereas other schools in the city, it's just, this is a building, this is where we plopped it. Granted, I'm sure there's community within that building, but here it feels like the entire school has a community with themselves and then with the site itself. So I guess it's a huge impact on the students, not even just architecture students.
This is Anthony. I completely agree with what Jess just said. I mean, half the reason why I came here was the whole aspect of the campus being like a park. You can walk from one end of the campus to the other, probably see the same person twice on your way back, but it's just like you're taking a stroll through a park, and you're basically immersed in historical buildings that have been here since the cornerstone was laid. So I think the aspect of having historical buildings around you sort of adds to the built environment, even though we don't really acknowledge it initially. But in the long run, it adds to our cultural heritage, especially being on the campus.
Do you like the mixture of the modern and the old? A lot of campuses are sort of distinctive in that.
I think it definitely has its benefits. I think there's definitely a clash as we evolve in the built environment. The modern is definitely going to flourish a lot more than the historical will. But I think they can mesh well together if they, like buildings like this, if they're used adaptively, really used.
I think, this is David, I think one of the questions, Anthony, is on this campus in particular, do you think, because I imagine that when the new buildings are built, there are voices in the community that say that they have to, not just physically work with the existing context, but do they work aesthetically in other realms? So I don't know if anyone around the room has any comments about that. Evan?
Just Evan White, as a teacher here, I'm very, very cognizant of the background. I can give you a good example. We do knowledge exchange for the Specter Center, where faculty give us a share of their research with students and other faculty. And the first one we did with Kim was in performance space. He was great, but space was a disaster. The performance space has far too high of a ceiling, terrible acoustics, and has no intimacy of any kind. If anything, it discourages intimacy and it encourages insulation. It really is difficult to teach there. The second and third one we did upstairs in 201 in our storehouse in this building, which is a fireplace and beautiful molding, low ceilings and windows, and it was fantastic, as was the second one. And it was the built environment that made it happen. If Keon had done his upstairs, it would have been fantastic. But it doesn't work. I think we have to be really cognizant, people here who are designers, of making the room work. It's just not whether it's pretty, but it's a feeling. People like smaller spaces, they feel comfortable. This room, the fireplace, it allows for discussion. And that's something that is not enough of this building on campus. That's why I think this is so special.
Well, and I think it's interesting because what you're saying, this is Dave again, is that different functions, different activities need different types of environments, whether they're large spaces, small spaces, intimate spaces, or more monumental spaces. And I think our campus, we don't have a lot of monumental spaces, but we certainly have a variety of spaces, so that you might want the performance space for an orientation session. That works well. If you've got 200 people in a room, that wouldn't work very well in this building. But on the other hand, a discussion like this would kind of get drowned out, as you mentioned, as it did previously in another kind of a space. Evan Lane challenged me 2 weeks ago when we were talking about this panel, because he felt that there was a lot of controversy about saving older buildings. The amount of cost, and we don't have to talk about this building yet because I know that's later in the discussion, but just in general, the impact of a community spending a lot of resources on a building that is from another era and which might incur a lot of additional expenses just to get the building to be inhabitable or usable for everyday contemporary functions. So I wonder if anybody has any observations about that in general, other experiences that you may have had in other places besides campus.
Hi, this is Kim. So we're working on a project in studio. It's Germantown High School that was closed 2 years ago. There was such a large outcry of it closing because it was so iconic. It was, in existence for 100 years. That probably 300 people got together to try to save it. They wanted to make it into a charter school, but the problem with the building is it's gigantic, and it's too big for the community. There's not enough kids to go to Germantown High School. So we came up with an idea of reusing it as a charter school and also a hotel, and it might have some restaurants, and it might have some live-work play in it. But that didn't go over real well with sort of the stalwart, it's got to be a high school again. People were very attached to it being a high school. So throughout this whole process, along comes a developer who gets talked into buying the Germantown High School, plus other buildings in the city, because they're trying to get rid of a lot of these buildings. And he turns around and says, I don't really want that building. It's too big. I don't know what to do with it. I do want these other ones. And so he's now trying to sell the high school. The reason I bring all of this up is, one, it's a really interesting story, but two, it really is a dilemma as to what to do with these things, because it's so big. But people then get attached to the way it was originally used. They don't want to see a hotel in it. They don't want to see a restaurant, because that's not the way it should be used. So.
We actually had a project similar to that. Sorry, it's Jess. We, in D6, I think, D5, we took an old school in Philadelphia that had closed years ago. It was from the 1920s. And so our project was to turn it into something that the community would use. So one of my classmates put out a sign with a Sharpie attached and said, what do you want on this? What do you want this to be? And so we took all of the community's suggestions. They actually wrote on it. That was the first surprise, right? They actually wrote on it, and we took their suggestions and we turned that into a community center. And then we had presented that idea to whatever the community is on South Street. I forget what it's called. Cessna? And so they took a couple of the projects and talked to the community, like, do we want to do something with this? So our project could impact someone else's neighborhood because we decided not to knock down the old school and actually keep it, because it was a monument for the neighborhood. That's what people knew, and we wanted to revamp that and make that something that could use. Because currently it's just kind of abandoned.
This is Dominic Hawkins. I actually, in addition to being an architect, do a lot of preservation planning across the country. And I get to drop into places that are beloved by their residents and help them communicate what's important about their place. So it's kind of a privilege and honor and a really scary proposition in certain parts of the country and certain parts of Philadelphia. And there is a real consistent love and specialness of place. Granted, these people are seeking someone like me out, so they've already identified that the place is important, but they don't necessarily have the tools or the vocabulary to describe it or to promote it or to document it or whatever it might be. So neighborhoods, places, streetscapes, historic districts, cities are actually extraordinarily important to the people who are there because of the general sort of character, rhythm, scale, grit, whatever it might be. And it's scale in terms of big and small. So it's the continuity of a row house, but then you look at the cornice and the little brackets and the doors being spaced just so. And it's not necessarily glorious architecture as an architectural statement. It is a connection to the past of the people who are of the place. And having worked in places like Tacony, which is 7 miles north of Center City, and they look at me and say, "You want me to go where? In Center City?" No, we don't leave the neighborhood. I mean, it's very much a place of place. So their main street is their main street, and the little stores along it, and no one building is special. Yes, there's the school. Yes, there's the community center. Yes, there's the Carnegie Library. So there are some, I'll say, kind of points of higher architectural interest, but that doesn't in essence matter. It's really the rhythm of the streetscape that matters. So getting that sense of place is very different than any number of I'll say new development townhouses that one could drop into anywhere in the country.
So a lot of...
If I could add, I'm Susan Madison, adding to the sense of place of the campus to not only increase the awareness of historic structures, but of the landscape features and materials that relate to the historic structures. We have a wonderful collection of trees, fences, gates, all sorts of other site materials that could help increase the awareness.
Right, and that's why I frame this as built environment. In fact, we could also include, not built environment, but certainly anything that's been improved by people, whether it's a garden, a building, an interior, a statuary. I mean, the whole built environment is why I sort of framed it that way. So we probably would say that there's a good group of people who would agree that considering the built environment and its restoration or preservation is worthwhile, but how sustainable is it? Can we talk about stories or studies that have shown whether it's true that a historic building or any kind of built environment element is as sustainable as building something new which might be able to accommodate new technologies?
Jess, we, in Theories of Architecture, we recently talked about sustainability and historic preservation and how the two they should be connected, but for whatever reason they're separated, that you can't have a historic building that's also sustainable. But that's, and we had talked about how originally when people were trying to do LEED was just about new buildings. And now they've incorporated this, well, if you can reuse an old building, then that gets you a ton of points. So that's what they did for C. It was the old gym. And I love that. I love having a studio in there. It's a lot better than AD, which used to be the library. But
we're good at reuse.
But this whole, I love being in old buildings that have been revamped to have another purpose. That all of the buildings on campus, we're in historic preservation drawing class, we are documenting some of the gatehouses and then Hager Hall. And you go into the places and you're like, oh, well, this is just learning and advising. This is what I do. And then you go in and you look at all of the tiny little details that they left all of this. They made sure to keep every little molding so that you could experience the place. You could experience and see how a house would work in there. And the, the White House, the President's office, is beautiful. That it was this old building that it was a house and it was gorgeous. And now they've turned it into offices and they did it really well. And it's just, I loved having to walk into there and be like, oh, cool, I get to walk into this beautiful building that now has a new purpose, whereas they could have just torn it down and built an office building and it would have been, I guess, okay.
So you're talking about, this is David, you're talking about social sustainability and people's historical connections and development of a community, and that's great. And you indicated that we do have on campus that kind of environment. What about economic sustainability? What about environmental sustainability issues, ecology, and so forth? I don't know, Rob.
This is Rob. So with sustainable design, the first thing we ask at the beginning of a project is, should we build, period. If we can find a way not to build something new or even renovate, we will do that first, because we're looking at the total carbon generated from a project. And the second part we would look at is, could we renovate rather than build new? Typically, unless you have something that's really in disrepair, the embodied energy, and you guys all know the term embodied energy, right, Reza? Is going to be less than building a new building. So if we look at it just from carbon, from that point of view, carbon is money, it's energy, we do that. And then we always look at building new as the last resort, typically. And I think that's really important. And the other thing you should know, which is really nice, LEED version 4, and everybody hates LEED, right? Raise your hand if you hate LEED, right? LEED version 4 now will give you 5 points if you choose to renovate a historic structure rather than building new. So you're seeing the beginning of the convergence of sustainability and historic preservation. We joke around in our program that historic preservation is proto-sustainability. It was really the beginning of sustainability before sustainability existed, because the mantra is, there is all of this great stuff that's already, why waste, why start over? So I think it's a natural fit, actually. It's a really good, close fit.
The National Park Service on their website has the famous quote, "The greenest building is the one that's already built," end quote. But I'm wondering, are there documents that actually can prove this? Have you seen studies that show, well, if we retain this building and preserve it, we will be spending X amount of money to run it in terms of the energy use, versus if we rebuild it using modern materials and so forth? I mean, I
don't think the calculus is that simple, because if you start with an old building, presumably 100 years old, so there was this amount of energy and money that went into it at the beginning. So at the point it was finished constructed, the day they unlocked the door, the physical fabric started deteriorating. At different points, there may have been additional energy put in, additional money, additional materials to fix it, and then again it starts that slide down. So it's this constant, wave. And if this building got a little further down on that slide than we would have liked, but the possibility, because the initial materials, the craftsmanship was so high, that building has a potential for a much longer lifespan. If you look at most of new construction today, I would argue that most buildings, and if you look at sort of just the warranty periods on every material you put into that building, you get 30 years, and then you're replacing everything. So, and the quality of construction isn't as good. The environmental air quality tends not to be as good. You're relying on all these adhesives and plastics and carpets and things that have the respiratory issues, and all this stuff is bad. Yes, your wall is tighter. Yes, your windows don't leak as much air. Yes, your roof is better insulated. But I don't think it's an equal equation. So I don't know how you can do the math in a simplistic way.
You have to take the long-term view, is what you're saying, because buildings that last a long time should be counted for all the amount of time that they've been in existence.
Right, you have to do a life cycle analysis beyond the initial, okay, it will cost me X thousand dollars to run it a year. I don't think that math makes any sense.
As the person that sort of, not sort of, I manage the facility here in terms of trying to make the budgets work, the new construction, when we're constructing and also operating, it really comes down to a case-by-case basis. The devil's really in the detail in many ways. I would say that this house was pretty much on the bubble. I mean, we needed grants to make the equations work. I look at we're a tuition-driven institution, so the students are really fueling the physical plant here and facilities here. I mean, it's you and students that came before you. So, the value to the students, it's important, I think, to have certain buildings like this for their enrichment, but then we also have to have buildings that get the job done in terms of educating, in the different ways. So it's a balance. The regulations that have come in over time since these buildings have been built for, ADA and a number of other things, and even energy, sort of put a historic building at a disadvantage in many ways. We chose not to go after LEED on this building. We may have been able to get it. I don't. Maybe under LEED 4 we might have gotten it. We looked at even insulating the walls and what that would do compared to leaving them barren, because barren's better, as it was proven to me. for the duration of the building and this type of construction. So it's in some ways we're studying. Right now, I mean, we're going to track. This building, by the way, has got a terrific vapor barrier now. It doesn't have a lot of insulation. It has a terrific building automation system. We did some air tests on it, and it's not as good as a brand new building, but it's pretty good. And it's phenomenal. The designers did a good job, and the craftsmen did a good job. So it'll be a real good study. But our net square foot to the cost here was not as good as say a generic classroom building. That's not the intention of the building. So if you were trying to assemble in a university, I think entirely out of historic buildings, you might go broke. But if you can have a balance, I love it personally.
Can I just correct one thing? We don't have a vapor barrier, we have an air barrier.
An air barrier, okay. I stand corrected. Okay.
Susanna.
This is Susanna. The Green Lab of the National Trust for Historic Preservation put out a really interesting report that all of my students would be happy to discuss with you after the program, which actually takes existing buildings and new construction, kind of levels the playing field, and then looks at, cost, environmental, health, CO2, carbon, all of that stuff. And they found, and obviously it's one report and further study needs to be done, but the conclusion was that for buildings, except for warehouse buildings converted to residential, because there's such a high amount of infrastructure that needs to go in, because these buildings are basically empty, that it was always a benefit to adaptively reuse a building than it was to build new. So there is literature out there, and I think it's growing. I'd like to just say that I think, Rob, that your outlook on first looking at existing buildings and kind of looking at new construction as a last resort, if you will, I think that's a highly unusual and probably not the typical outlook. And I think it's a real, I think preservationists have been pushing I almost hate the term, hate that thing, the greenest building is the one that's already there, because it's just, I don't know, it's just nauseating because it's meaningless, because it hasn't generated any further interest or thought about the subject. And I think sustainability and historic preservation do go hand in hand. And I think in terms of, Roxborough House, I wasn't here, I trust what you all were saying. But if we let any building deteriorate, it's going to take more to bring it back. You can't say that it's the fault of the historic building, okay? If we take care of our buildings, right, maintenance is preservation. That was popular in the 70s. But I think it's still valid today. So, not to question what you said, but I think we have to also take into account, if we let any building deteriorate, it will require a greater investment.
Many times it's the previous owners that
no doubt. And I'm not picking, I shouldn't have picked on Roxborough House, because it's true across the board.
I mean, it's a good example. Let's not go to anything that's historic in some ways, but just look at Independence Plaza. And that's a building that was built in 1961, pretty generic. It was more worthwhile to invest in those structures than to knock them down and to build new. And they had really deteriorated. I mean, but the university paid about $4.5 million for those buildings at the time, knowing that there was $8 million worth of deferred maintenance. Twice the value of what we paid for them. But new construction at that time, and it's more now, would have been somewhere around $35 million. So it was a value to do it. But when we went in there, the sewage lines weren't even connected. So it was, here we have some pictures. I mean, my God, you could see through the wall. And the people that own the home did their best, but they went bankrupt trying to keep it going. So we were fortunate to be able, I think in some ways, if you can get the right combination of grants, because I think having historic buildings for the benefit of the public is somewhat of a public good, not just an owner's good. Then it works.
I just want to follow up something Tom said, because you're talking a lot of dollars and cents. I'm a historian. There's a magic in a building that you can't be measured in money. This building in particular, there were famous people here.
Yep.
Clark, Lewis and Clark, was right here in this room. Can you put a value on that? It makes this room special. Most likely Thomas Jefferson, whatever you think of him, was here. My students, I put that in for them. I'm not a big fan. But there's magic to that.
Yeah.
That you're on the floor that they were, and you can't measure that in dollars and cents. It's impossible, and that makes us as human beings happy to be in this room. It has an aura.
Let me just jump in. That's the problem with sustainability. It doesn't have the magic. And so what's happening right now is this horrible triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, doesn't resonate, especially with designers who spend a lot of their life trying to make things beautiful. And so what we're trying to do now is push this concept of the quadruple bottom line. The idea we're going to have people, planet, profit, and place. And that when we ever pursue a project, we're going to create that sense of place as intrinsic to the sustainability of it. Can we generate new construction that wants to be renovated in the future? That's the new challenge for new construction. Are you designing something that will be renovated in that 30 years when they all get back? Or will it be torn down and something new will be created? And that's really where the discussion is starting to come into sustainability now, which I think will have a lot better chance of success. Does it sound crazy? Or
no, because I think that this is Susanna. I think that preservationists, as Dominique pointed out earlier, have been talking about place and sense of place for a really long time. And I hear this, and I think it's maybe good news that preservation and sustainability may be getting closer. I'm still waiting, and I expect to wait longer. But I think that's true, and I think that as a culture we have been focusing more on place. I think the whole interest in parks. You can see it here in Philadelphia, pop-up parks and, the area along the river and that development. We're looking more at our environment, and I think that maybe this is part of the trend.
And I also think because preservation is moving into mid-century, this is Dominique Hawkins, I'm sorry, because preservation is moving into mid-century modern buildings, which look modern and new, and we're dealing with those new materials, but new bad materials, because what was done in the 50s was really kind of horrid. And trying to balance yes and no. And I will say that one of the places that I got to work was GM Tech, which was designed by Sargent. So it was the General Motors Technical Center in Michigan, which is a sensational place. And it was an interesting blend of modern architecture with craft. So they literally did hand-glazed bricks for these colored, fabulous brick walls on these very modern, modular office buildings. It was that combination of craft and airplane technology, automotive technology, because they made car panels for the walls of these buildings. So it was this very modern thing with this craft, handmade glazed brick, and that contrast was really interesting. So, but there was still an intrinsic quality to the thought process, the design, the textiles in the building, from the drapes to the furniture to the carpets to the handmade woodwork that was in the office suites. So.
Clearly that was a building that was meant to survive.
Yes.
The irony of this building, because it was a frame country house, makes me wonder. I mean, of course, it's valuable from that point of view. It's on the city register because how many country houses are left in Philadelphia? Not a lot. But this one, built as a frame house, makes you wonder how long did the original owners expect it to last? And by some miracle or some miracle, but here it is. That just between the comments that Dominique and Rob just made about building things to last or not building them to last, I think there has been a shift in society in the last 10 years or so. Clearly, most buildings are built knowing they don't need to last for 30 years because the owners aren't going to want them there in 30 years. But it's a complicated issue.
Dominique, again, we're in an intrinsically transient society, so we're in any one place for a minute and a half. We live in a place for 5 years, we sell, we want the bigger house or the house in a different city, we got a job elsewhere, but we are no longer vested in owning a piece of property and passing it on to our children.
No.
So
that's a big difference.
And that's a huge
Cultural
difference
change.
because it's a difference not only in how we're building, it's a difference in how we're maintaining, and it's a difference in the long-term choices we're making associated with the building. So we'll put on the asphalt roof, we'll paint away the wood rot because we're selling it in less than 5 years and we're moving on. It's no longer my problem.
That's right. There was a...
You touched on it a little bit.
Please identify yourself.
My name is Matt. I'm a fifth-year architect. I'm also taking a historic preservation class with Suzanne Barca. I think this really comes down to a general responsibility to culture, just kind of something you're getting into. And a lot of these buildings, like you're talking about, they were built for, this is your home. You built it, you lived on it, and it meant something to you. And now, I mean, even earlier we were talking about kind of, do we keep this old building or do we make a new one that's not going to be as tight? And it comes down to the responsibility of the designer, the responsibility of the owner, of not just building something to make the economic sense, but we really should be kind of investing more into our building and trying to make something that kind of lasts a little bit longer. And I think this really goes to kind of a responsibility, even sustainability-wise, trying to think for our future and not so much for the short term.
I think. Sorry.
Going off of that, it's especially prevalent in just even your average house. My house was built, I guess, there's what looks like an old farmhouse, like an old, basically plantation home in my backyard. So my house was built in the 70s. I guess they sold their farm, but they kept that house and sold the rest of the land, and they built these as quick as you can, as cheap as you can houses that have zero insulation, and now we're trying to deal with that. They're built like, oh, well, we need a house, so just build it. But they decide to keep that old home, whereas when I go to work out in New Jersey, we're dealing with new construction homes in a development that used to be a farm, but there is no old house there. It's just open land where they didn't think, I guess, the house wasn't important enough or whatever reason. But I like that I can be in my house in the nightmare that it is, but I can look in my backyard and see that there's history, and I know why my house was constructed. And even that, I guess, is historic preservation and sustainability for me, because I can look out and see it. I can see what they did, whereas in other places they just tore it down and it didn't matter. But it's important, and I like that kind of concept.
This is David. That legibility appeals to a certain kind of person who wants to understand the environment that they're living in. I know we have a few minutes left. I'd like to open, sort of not redirect, but move the discussion along in a way that really deals with how do we prepare people to be contributors to that environment. What do students need to know in their education? What do they need to learn in their education so that they can be professionals and contribute to an environment where the built environment is as sustainable as possible in all the realms that can be, as well as just average students, and how do they become better consumers of the built environment? I'm sorry to use that word, but as designers and preservationists, you do have clients, and if your client doesn't appreciate what you're trying to sell them, it's harder to sell them. So how in general do we educate people to have an appreciation for these issues of the built environment and preservation and sustainability altogether?
I think that's one of the struggles with, this is Anthony, I think it's one of the struggles with using pre-existing buildings. I mean, I know I've come across a problem with adaptive reuse, where you're basically dealing with the floor plan that you have to rework to deal with it. So it's almost like problem solving, basically. And I think any design is going to have that problem. So I think the future would be not necessarily knock it down, just find another way to fix it, because then it will work. And you can make it marketable. I mean, I know a developer will just say, all right, knock it down, but it's still, that even can go back to the whole thing about using resources. I mean, there was invested resources when it was initially built. Why waste that? You're just negating the fact that you put more resources into an existing building.
So are you saying, Anthony, that really it comes down to giving students opportunities to have projects like this so that they can
Exactly.
learn about them and learn how to argue, to make the arguments to support their case.
Exactly.
And
It's
okay.
a challenge. Especially, we had a project in D8 where we had to use an existing building. We had to choose a factory. We had chosen one of them in Philadelphia, right down along the train tracks. Because I go down those train tracks and I look at all of those and I see the potential in them. Whereas I'd be riding down with my friend who knows nothing about architecture or anything like that, and he looks at it and he sees an old building that's just waiting to be torn down. Whereas we need to teach people to see that potential and see that, yeah, it might be harder to work. It's easier to work with a blank canvas, but it's more of a challenge and it's more fun to design something where you're given these parameters and you can only design within those parameters. And you have this building that just needs to have something done with it. It's just, we need to teach people
This is
that.
Rob. So I was getting back to your point. We have new tools that we didn't have before. So we can do full life cycle analysis. We can do full building simulation. We begin to project over 30 years what our simple choices will mean for 30 years. We didn't have those tools 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So now we can start to think long term with some more confidence. Because I think we know intuitively that the existing building is going to be better, but we really need to prove it. Because people are ultimately paying for that, right, Tom? Yeah. So I think I'm very optimistic about the next 5 years in this, using these tools that are emerging that are going to give us insight into how we can make better decisions for the long term, which is what we'd like to do.
And how successful is the Sustainable Design Program in getting the students to use these tools? Do they master them quickly because they're familiar with those technologies, or what are the results of implementing these tools into the curriculum?
So you had to dig deeper, didn't you?
All right.
You couldn't just let that hang out there. So the one that we're using right now, there's a student doing, you guys know what Passive House is, which is the German model for energy efficiency. He's from the Middle East, and Passive House doesn't work. So he did a 30-year life cycle assessment and energy assessment of what does it mean to design a house in the Middle East that can persist from an energy point of view, and he was able to visualize that, not quickly, not easily, and with still a great amount of difficulty. So we're not really quite there yet. And you guys are using the thing in Revit with from KTA is designing new software that will take different building assemblies and compare a brick wall versus a steel wall versus a wood wall and give you carbon outputs for all of those. So it's still not easy, but we think within another few years it'll be there.
For some reason, I think we're doing something right. You know, just in terms of the university's approach. Maybe it's the students we're selecting. Maybe it's why the students select us. But as a facility guy, I track everything. And one of the things that I track is vandalism and damage to our buildings. And we don't get it. You know, on this campus, the students respect the built environment. We spend less than 1% of our time or money on putting back something that was wrecked. You know, and that includes academic vandalism. Academic vandalism is where the student got robust and decided to spray paint or spray glue something in the carpet. So I mean, less than 1%. And when I talk with my colleagues in the area, you know, that's a constant problem for them. So I really do appreciate the students and the faculty and maybe some of the programs that we have here, because that's not on my agenda of problems. It's a good thing. We are a member of APA, and APA went to institutional membership. I just wanted to bring this up because
Can you describe what APA is?
APA, well, it used to stand for the Association of Physical Plant Administrators. Now it stands for Leadership in Educational Facilities, which doesn't make any sense. But, but nobody wanted to be the physical plant guy anymore. But in any event, they've opened that up to the campus, so nationwide. So any student, faculty member, whatever, come see me, I'll get you registered. But why I bring that up is APA has a model called Total Cost of Ownership. It was developed out of Morgan College in Salt Lake City, BYU. And it's pretty neat. And they look at the full life cycle from cradle to grave. And that college, has a lot of new buildings and a lot of old buildings, but they really do take care of the buildings out there, right? And they've built this model, and it's available to anybody if you want to teach it. It's there.
So I'm just going to be the downer. This is Kim.
Yeah.
So this is all great, and your tools are great. But I think one of the things that we're not talking about is our footprint compared to the rest of the world. And the fact that we need probably 6 planets for enough materials to keep going where we're going. And so we can do all sorts of life cycling, and we're going to do a steel wall rather than a wood wall. But if we don't have the materials, in fact, to do that, it's not going to work at the rate we're going. And the other thing is just to sort of advocate, Susan, you're with me on this, is advocate for the landscape in this discussion of preserving historic landscapes and looking at not just the house but also how people lived in the house. And I think sometimes that gets wiped away because we're so worried about the building and not really thinking about how people lived in this place. Where was Thomas Jefferson? Where did he sleep? Where did he go outside? How did he sort of interact with the landscape?
I think that's what's great about vernacular architecture, because vernacular architecture, every house is built for a purpose. Dr. Breiner?
Grades are due.
Every house is built for a purpose, and every room in that house had a purpose. So, you look now, like we talked about cultural landscapes, where what used to be a battlefield is now Levittown. It's basically cookie cutter houses that are sprawled out over 50 acres of land. You're no longer preserving that cultural landscape. Instead, you're just filling it with, I don't want to say garbage, but you're filling it with dollhouses, basically. It's not history. It's just...
But now that is
history.
It is.
Well, now it's history.
Only because it was the first one. Right?
Exactly.
Hey,
That's
there
history.
are others.
I think he was using Levittown with a small L.
Yes.
Yeah, small L.
This is Tom again. Prior to coming here, I worked for a company that had plants overseas. And I got to be friends with a fellow that lived right next to the Battle of the Bulge. And his house was literally just off the battlefield. And it looked like frankly, compared to, it was a square house. Didn't look very descriptive at all. But he was so proud to be there, and he said to me, Tom, these walls can stop a 50 caliber bullet. And that was really important to him. It was part of the history. And I think in some ways, why this house got lucky is because this was part of war was happening. And if you look back at the maps, this was part of a war landscape. And some of the things, like the doors and so forth, are a little more durable to, stop a musket ball or stop something like. And maybe that's sort of why. It might have been part of the time. I don't know if they built it to be here 100 years. I think in some ways they built it to save their skin, and it worked,
Does anyone have other suggestions about, especially for those of you who are primarily in the professional world, what are young people coming out of school doing well in terms of these skills, and what maybe are things that you want to tell the educators that they need to work more on before they enter the workforce?
This is Susanna. I just, you're ready to jump in, and I'll step aside in a second. But I think, I know that we're not concluding, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to say that I agree with you with regard to the landscape. I think like sustainability. I don't know why academically there isn't more collaboration between us as faculty and the students. I have 2 architecture students in my preservation studio, and they came in with, I think, not too much knowledge of preservation. They didn't take any of the preservation courses. And hopefully you've gotten a new outlook on things based on your projects I believe you have. But I feel like we need to collaborate more, because we're not going to move the ball forward in a larger sense unless the students understand how to collaborate and how all these pieces fit together. So I would say, architects design, preservationists design too, but I think that they bring to projects is kind of a more in-depth understanding of history and basing their choices on that history. And I think that's what really makes the difference. And so, sustainability fits in there too, but how do all these pieces fit together when you have, like, it would be like a dream project to have, like a summer studio where we take one historic site with, great landscape, great house, great building, and we get this group of students together from all these different areas kind of looking at how all these pieces and parts work together, so that when they get out of here, they know that when they work on a historic building, they should be thinking about the landscape, and they should be thinking about sustainability. I think
that makes a lot of sense.
Collaboration is kind of a watchword professionally, and I think we need more of that academically. That's my contribution. So take it away, Debbie.
Suzanne Singletary, I teach history here, and I'm very interested in the preservation program. And as this conversation was developing, I kept thinking about exactly what the point you're making, and that in Europe, there isn't a split. They don't have preservation here, sustainable design here, architecture there. It's one seamless, integrated whole. And that the architects get out and they know about preservation. Of course, there's a lot more opportunity they're going to be working on historic buildings. But we don't have these segmentations and these categories that are so discrete. And certainly we have a lot of opportunity for collaboration here that I don't think we take advantage of. And I think the architects still don't get this dimension unless they happen to take one of our classes. So, yeah.
Well, and likewise, I can see in my studio, I think the preservation students learn a lot from the architects. I mean, it's a,
yeah, exactly.
I think what we have to be careful about, though, is that we don't make a generalization. So this is design class, which incorporates architects, this and that. I think it's important that we have our different studies, and then we have this moment where we come together and connect. Because without this moment where I take my architecture class and join with historic preservationists, we don't bring that sense of specialty. So I think there needs to be some kind of balance between having the collaboration and the individual study.
So as somebody who's hiring constantly, I'll make a couple of points. I'll say, first of all, I think that sustainability is integrating itself more and more into practice. I mean, I think if you look back 25 years ago, there were ADA specialists, and there were sort of, I don't know if it was degrees, but there were professional ADA experts, and it's gotten to the point where architects are just expected to do that, and I think that more and more sustainability is just a result of this is part of becoming a mainstream thought process of design. So I don't think those things are different. I would say one of the biggest challenges for any design professional, be it a preservation-oriented or I'll say pure architecture or a landscape architect, is actually being able to communicate in a way that allows clients to appreciate the vision. Tom and I have had many a conversation about this building, and I think I pulled him kicking and screaming part of the way to the point of getting here. But it was about being able to, in a way, communicate a vision of what was possible, and have not only the knowledge behind and the experience on other projects to be able to demonstrate that, but also be able to tailor the message to what the universities needed to hear and hear them. I think the whole, as design students, designers get so caught up in designing, they forget they actually have to speak and write and be able to basically convince an audience to move forward with whatever they want to spend millions of dollars on.
Thank you for that.
So I guess this is our opportunity. We have a minute left. If anybody has a burning desire to make a comment about something that we haven't resolved or feels that they haven't had their opinion expressed adequately, does anybody have I'm just so excited, first of all, that so many people are here and that the panel was able to sustain a discussion. I think we could probably go on for a few more hours, really, if there was some wine and other stuff. But I'd like to then kind of conclude. I was looking on the internet for interesting quotes and so forth about this topic, and I came across one by Audrey Niffenegger, who is the author of The Time Traveler's Wife. And this is the quote from her. Chicago, and I'm sorry it's about Chicago, not Philadelphia, but Chicago has so much excellent architecture that they feel obliged to tear some of it down now and then and erect terrible buildings just to help us all appreciate the good stuff. And I think I'm glad that that didn't happen in the case of this house. I know it will continue to happen off and on depending on the circumstances, but I'm really glad that we could be in this room, talk about issues that really matter to our society, and to prepare our students for working in an environment that will be improved as time goes on. So thank you to the panelists and to the audience. Thank you to Evan Lane for putting this whole program together throughout the year. I know